Hey,
Good morning.
good morning. How are you?
Doing well. How are you all?
I'm sorry, I was down in the Susan Gray School. It's the first day of school down there, and I got completely absorbed with saying hello to kids.
Oh, nice.
It's great. Yeah, it's okay. We have 85 kids in a school in this building that are all like 1 to 5, and I run a couple of classrooms down there, so that's where I was. Can you see me?
Oh, no, I can't. I see a picture of
Yes.
flowers and some students.
Yeah, that's probably
There we
better.
go.
Okay, there. Ooh, my office is a mess.
Oh.
Okay. It's the usual thing.
So thank you so much, Anne, for doing this
Sure.
conversation with
Sorry
us.
I'm late.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm actually here with another class of mine, a language and literacy class, reading and writing across the continuum, so they're sitting in. Thanks again, and that school sounds wonderful. So this is in the same building that you work?
Yeah, I'm on the 3rd floor, and this is our whole 1st floor is an inclusive preschool for 85 kids.
Oh, that's excellent.
25% of them have disabilities, and I actually have just this semester with a couple of my amazing graduate students running 2 toddler classrooms after the Emory Walden model.
Oh, okay.
You know that they do this really great inclusive model for toddlers with autism. And so we have mixed etiology for kids with disabilities, but we're using that same living environments, intensive intervention model in the classroom. And this was the first day, so I wanted to meet the parents.
Oh, that sounds great.
It's going to be great. We need another week or 2 to get ready, but it's going to be great.
So we're really excited to do this project where students are in this class taking Introduction to Research. They read research papers, read out of texts about different methods in research. But actually speaking to researchers helps bring these ideas to life and brings these studies to life. And so the main question is, what's a study that you're excited about and you'd like to share about? And what do you think is interesting about it?
Okay. So let me say from the beginning that I'm a blue-collar researcher, which means that I'm an intervention researcher. I'm really hands-on. My whole team is hands-on with kids and families, and that's just how we operate. So I can talk about any of our projects. I have 2 different projects. I might talk for us. I have about 4 different things running at the same time, but there are 2 that are really interesting.
Yes.
So Meg Roberts and I just finished an IES Gold 3 study that was a randomized design looking at our parent language intervention that's called Enhanced Milieu Teaching, or sometimes in our neighborhood called KidTalk, where we worked with toddlers who had receptive and expressive language delays and were on average about 2.5, about 30 months old when they came into the study. And so one of the things that's interesting about these kids is that they don't qualify for any other services.
Oh, wow.
They're cognitively in that broadly defined typical range, but they have significant receptive and expressive delays. We did our best to screen out kids with autism, although that turned out not to be quite perfect. But we were interested in prevention and whether we can change the language and ultimately the reading trajectories for these kids. So randomly assigned to treatment or control, parents got...
And sorry to interrupt you, just to fill in for the students, this goal 3 is this efficacy study where you're taking a practice that's been developed very well, and the practice you're talking about has been refined over a number of years with a lot of studies supporting its validity. And then this is to try to do it at a higher quality research level.
It is, and it's a new population of kids because there are not very many especially big group studies with this age of toddlers. We know some things about this population. We know that kids who have expressive only delays have a pretty high rate of recovery because it's expressive only and they're pretty cognitively intact and linguistically intact kids. But this population of kids with receptive and expressive delays are really interesting. So one of our things was to, first of all, find out how many of these kids are there, and then to ask whether this intervention that's mostly been done with older kids, either with autism or with cognitive impairments, would be an effective prevention for these toddlers. And so I think what's interesting about the study is that it has that other piece to it. So it's about demonstrating the efficacy of enhanced milieu teaching, but it's also asking this question, for this group of kids, can we actually get them on a different trajectory of language development? And that's kind of a little bit different question than we usually ask.
That's really terrific. One of our speakers kicking off our class in this cohort of early intervention, early childhood students was a researcher here at Portland State who was hearing impaired. She's deaf, and asked the question of the students: is it inevitable that children, exiting preschool, going into kindergarten, come in behind their peers? And this research fits perfectly, trying to answer that question.
Right now is, what is that vocabulary gap in particular deterministic for kids? If you come in at kindergarten already behind in language development, what are our options for getting you on a different trajectory? Which is a hard research question and an interesting one. So for these kids, we randomly assigned them either to 24 sessions, which is not much, of parent plus therapist, where the therapist worked with the child in a play-based interaction, did enhanced milieu teaching, and then taught the parent at home how to play with their kids, but also how to use these strategies across snacks and meals and bath and bedtime routines and storybooks and all kinds of things. Sure. And the intervention was about 2 times a week, half in the clinic, half at home. Usually my therapist, I have like the greatest therapists in the world. I do. Just amazing people. Taught the parent in a really supportive, naturalistic way in the home, and then used the clinic to really focus on the child. So the kid's getting this dosage of high-fidelity treatment from a therapist, and their parents getting trained. And that's a little different than many parent studies, and the treatments are well-coordinated. What that allows us to do is for the therapist to really be more refined in her teaching, hit targets better, be more precise, really help kids with speech and those sorts of things. A parent. But let's work with the parent on the stuff that's important to the family. So that's a really good combination. So we saw parents for about 3 months, twice a week at home, at home and in clinic. And at the end of the study, there were pretty definitive, about half a standard deviation outcomes for kids in treatment. So on average, they had about 10 more words in a language sample than their peers that were in the control group.
And the control group was just business as usual.
Right.
Yes.
And this is important because these are not kids getting intervention, because they don't, at least in Tennessee, they don't qualify. Now, Oregon might be a little more inclusive in conditions, but in Tennessee, we had so there are about 92 kids in this study. We had 2 kids that were getting speech therapy during the study. I mean, that really tells you that this is a population of kids that are underserved. So then we saw these kids again 6 months after, and we pretty much made that same effect. And the interesting thing was, in the control group, or in the treatment group, 65% of the kids no longer met the criteria for language delay.
Okay.
That was a really important change.
And the control group was?
And in the control group, about only 30% of the kids did not meet the criteria.
Okay.
So we reduced, so all kids started out, 100% of kids started out meeting that criteria. Mm-hmm. At the end, 65% of the kids in the treatment group no longer met that criteria, versus about 30% the control group. So we think that that's a really important finding. And at least in the short term, it supports this idea that we could get kids on a different developmental trajectory. Now, I'll tell you all the caveats about that. We also studied at the same time 120 typically developing toddlers. And we matched the language samples at 4 time points for our treatment, our control group, and our typical kids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a great idea. It's very interesting data, and there are all kinds of reasons why we wanted to do that.
Sure.
So what you see if you look at the slope is you see control kids changing a little, growing, but slowly. You see treatment kids growing and faster, and the difference is statistically significant, and the effect size is about 0.4.
Okay.
But then if you look at our typical toddlers, they're growing geometrically. And the gap has closed some. But in terms of this overall gap between typical kids and delayed kids, the effect size is huge, still like 1.3 or something in favor of the typically developing kids. So we were better than the control. We made significant progress, but we haven't closed that gap yet.
So I've been reading some of the treatment intensity studies, and we had a conversation with Paul Yoder, kind of comparing 1 time a week versus 4 plus, 4 to 5 times a week. Very interesting thinking about if you got that gain, what would be the effect if you could, double or triple the intensity.
I think it's a duration question more than a times per week, although, generally I think for most kids more is better, although Paul's data are not quite that equivocal about that point. Because we trained parents, and one of the parts of this study that was important was the very high fidelity of parent training and the multiple observations of parent implementation at home, because we wanted to know what the dosage was as a result of parent training. We got pretty good dosage reports from parents, somewhere between, the range was between 6 and 17 hours a week, and the mean was about 12. All of our parents reported training other people, the dad or a sibling or a grandparent.
Wow.
And high levels of parent satisfaction, high levels of parent fidelity. And those are important factors when you think about the effects, is that we had good fidelity on training parents. We had excellent fidelity by the parent and pretty good dosage estimates. So that's all important. The things I know about these kids that inform this dosage issue, they're a surprisingly heterogeneous group of kids. So in this group of 90 kids, there are kids that ended up being spectrum kids. 17% of the sample ended up with an autism diagnosis, although we tried to screen out kids that nobody had a diagnosis at the beginning and nobody flagged on the stat at the beginning. About halfway through the study, we started using the ADOS for all kids. And we didn't take kids that flagged early on, but still 17% of the sample flagged at about 4, which, high functioning, but still kids on the spectrum. There are some kids that clearly have motor speech impairments and were not speaking at the beginning of the study largely because of oral motor issues. And for those kids, although they made great progress in receptive language, some of them did not make great progress in expressive language because they continue to have motor speech issues. And then there are some kids that really have intellectual disabilities, even though they tested in the normal range, and those kids tend to be slower language learners. And then there's probably some kids that are going to be SLI kids. And then there's some typical kids in there that just for whatever reason. So I've just given you like 6 subgroups of kids.
Yes, it's fascinating though, from my perspective and for these students to hear this, that how this study is so close, like you led the conversation with, that it's so close to clinical intervention and good practice, that this is, from a generalization standpoint of taking the research into practice, this is what we would recommend, doing an intervention like this, and looking at early childhood and these screening interventions and Tier 1 RTI interventions. This is fantastic results that, just from the standpoint as well of being able to mobilize the families the way you did and get them participating in the intervention. Very, very encouraging findings.
One thing I want to just say is that one of our big things is not to disrupt the family, but to make this feel like you do with your kid, that you're not reorganizing your whole house around teaching language. You're just doing it when you're with your kid. And lots of parent effectiveness measures and lots of parent satisfaction, and really high parenting satisfaction, built in a lot of things to get feedback from parents as we went. And that, I think those are really important things. The important takeaways from this are, these are really young kids. These are parents who show up in research are highly motivated.
Sure.
These are parents that were concerned about their kids enough to come to Vanderbilt and do all of this stuff for us. The results are good, but there's some heterogeneity in the outcomes that are important. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, kids with autism did not do worse than the other kids.
Okay.
We had this idea that a short-term intervention like this might be a screen for kids with autism, that they wouldn't respond as well, and that would be a really great thing, but that did not turn out to be true. The kids with motor speech were the kids that had the least strong outcomes. And in spite of all those good things, we didn't close the gap with typical kids. And so there's a lot more to know about dosage, about precision. For these kids, the transition into syntax still looked like it was going to be pretty daunting. They did great on vocabulary measures, but there was no difference in the treatment and control group on the transition into syntax. So MLU was higher for the treatment group, but not significantly. And that says intervention might not only need to go longer, it might need to focus on that critical step into syntax for these kids that have specific language impairments.
Okay, right.
So all studies, you learn like 86 things you didn't plan on learning, but that's why you do research.
Right, that's really good for the students to hear, and good for me to hear as a relatively new researcher. That's really interesting, thinking about areas where you didn't see growth, how you can then enhance your intervention, add some targeted focus on different areas. Very interesting stuff. Sounds like
even if you have 90 kids, it's not enough kids to do the great statistical analyses that you want to do on subgroups and all those things. Yeah.
Sure.
No intervention study ever has enough kids. That's kind of a rule.
Right. We're just learning about group design and the basic statistical analyses and the fundamentals. So that's useful to hear. But really amazing that you were able to do that intervention over time. And you said this research was sponsored by Institute for Educational Sciences?
Right.
Okay. Right. Goal 3.
And goal 3, which, we were talking on the email about we're all putting in IES grants. And I think one thing to say to students is that the quality of design for IES grants is getting higher and higher. And I think that's a good thing, because I feel pretty confident that, so this study turned out to be a registered clinical trial, and it's under review at pediatrics. And so that's kind of new for people in our field to begin to think about really doing clinical trials and really trying to become part of the sort of mainstream intervention literature. And, who knows how it will fly in pediatrics. It got sent out for review, but I don't know whether it will fly. But that's an important thing for us as educators, to connect to pediatricians, to connect to policy level things. And as the quality of our studies gets better, the that will be able to do that, I think, is increasing. And that's an important change in our field.
One of the researchers we interviewed, Eric Sanders, talked about the question, kind of the two follow-up quick questions are, what do you think is most important for folks to know about research who are going to be clinicians? And he said that he thought one of the most important things was that research happens, in a research line, and that any given study is somewhere on that line. And these clinical trials, this is, when a research line is fairly mature. And so just putting that in perspective for the students, but great to see that level of evidence and level of quality of research increasing. It's very encouraging.
I think the emphasis on fidelity has been enormously important. So, because that's the foundation for us to be able to replicate anything. If we don't have a good description of fidelity, then as a clinician, you're trusting a lot when you read a research article. It's interesting. As you probably know, there's a big emphasis now on data sharing. And that's going to be, I think, really important, but also a pretty good emphasis on sharing your fidelity instruments. And as a clinician, one of the things that would help me understand an intervention is to look really carefully at what the researchers thought were the indicators of quality. Because you have the description, but you also need those quality indicators. And that together will make better clinical practice, I think.
That's very interesting. I had a recent discussion about that sometimes we feel like we read studies and we don't necessarily know how to do that intervention. So that's really good. And then the data sharing piece is fascinating for in the future being able to run larger studies, analyzing bigger sets of data. We're trying to develop a data format for our AAC research work with our transcriptions and our video coding. So we have a little markup language we're working on.
I would love to see that. A lot of my research is AAC stuff these days.
Yes.
I didn't talk about that, but we have a Downs project and we have Autism Center of Excellence, and we're using iPads in both of those projects. And I am familiar with the problems of transcription.
Oh, great. Yeah, I just saw in the Vanderbilt magazine an interesting article about your work.
Interesting, but maybe not completely accurate.
Oh, okay.
When the press picks up a study, just remember as a consumer, this is for your students, when you read about something in the press, it might not be the science that's being represented well, because the press looks at a study from a public interest perspective. And so the way they talk about that study is it was all about the iPad.
Right.
Way we look at that study is it was all about the quality of the naturalistic intervention. And so iPads were part of something that was really, and I'm nervous about talking to parents and saying, oh, it's the iPad, when it was the iPad nested in a really good intervention.
The iPad was a tool with the partner approaches.
Right.
Good.
You know this. I mean, you know that the partner's everything in using an AAC mode. That's a huge, and that message I didn't think came across in that article, and I so wanted it. I so tried to get them to make sure they said that. Partners are the critical piece, and the mode is helpful. Yeah.
Yes, very interesting how that theme keeps coming up in various ways in the field and in the news and such.
Yeah.
Important to keep going with that and fight it, but also I think it's that's I think very very encouraging too. Knowing that we can make a difference and that the technology is just one piece of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So last quick question: where do you think this research is headed? Educational research, special ed research. Kind of a broad question, but.
Well, I hope it's headed toward evidence-based practices. Don't you hope that's where we're going? And that was the whole point of this.
Right.
But
Okay.
it's key. You know, at the beginning of this, I was talking about being downstairs in the toddler classrooms. And so we've been working on enhanced milieu teaching for a long, long time. And we are really good at it. And we are really good at teaching parents to do it. But we have had less success moving it into classrooms. And so one of the reasons I'm doing these 2 toddler classrooms is trying to figure out what the context is in the classroom that's needed in order to do that kind of high quality milieu teaching. And it's complicated because the foundations of classrooms are complicated. It's about schedule, it's about staff training, it's about how the room works so that people have time to work with kids one-on-one.
Yes.
You know, it's about assessment, it's about targets, it's about everything. So these classrooms are, for me, the next step in this research, which is figuring out what teachers need to have in place in order to be able to use these evidence-based practices in their classrooms. And I don't think that I'm not at all thinking that teachers would have to run this whole model that we're running, but this is a really important lab for us right now to learn how to do this in classrooms with 2-year-olds where life is going on and there's 2-year-olds everywhere because that's very different than working one-on-one as a parent with your kid or working one-on-one as a therapist. And that's the level of implementation work that is hard to get that part funded, but essential for moving the field and for doing the next kind of randomized trial that's a classroom-based trial. At least for us, that's a big issue to figure that out.
Right now, are you doing this work as research, or is this more just workshopping?
I'm in those classrooms every day. I just spent the last 3 weeks in there with my graduate students setting up those classrooms with the idea that next year at this time I'm ready to write a research grant. But
Great.
It's before I could even write the grant, I had to know the right questions. I had to know what was feasible to do with teachers. I had to know what the classroom had to look and feel like. Because when we've tried doing this in Head Start, and it was okay. We tried doing this we had a great model demo where we worked with parents. We worked with the child's therapist, and then we went in the child's classroom and worked with the teachers. And those were all successful, except that high intensity, not a model that you could replicate. That worked, but I couldn't tell you how to replicate that. So what I'm looking for in these classrooms is, how can I learn how to do this in a way that's replicable? And when I think I have that, then I'm ready to write a research grant. And I hope that's next year, but it might not be.
Well, that's very neat for the students to hear. How this research is formed out of this work, this clinical work, and exploratory work with real kids. Well,
that's what I mean by we're blue collar researchers, because I'm an interventionist at heart and a preschool teacher at heart. So I have to see this work in a real environment with real kids. And I have to understand it theoretically. This doesn't diminish understanding it theoretically.
No.
It doesn't diminish measuring it, because that's the other huge challenge is the measurement piece of this. But I'm an intervention researcher, so I have to have all 3 of those pieces and feel confident before I can begin to ask good research questions and formulate studies that are going to have a reasonable level of integrity. Now, I'm slow, that's what I'm telling you, because I have to know that it works before I start asking that it can work, before I start asking questions about efficacy. Does that make sense? Because efficacy is really a replication task. Can I do this with 20 classrooms? So I got to see it work in a couple classrooms and understand how it works and understand how to measure it before I can ask that question.
That's very encouraging to me personally, in that I made a decision to kind of back off having one of our collaborators be a research site and make it just my community where I can serve and help and explore together with the teachers and parents there and the children there.
Good ideas come from having your hands on kids.
Yeah, it's important to be doing the work and not always have to be, going according to a research schedule where you can't change things and be the teacher that you are. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, as a student, probably, I was a graduate student at the University of Kansas, and the model there is very much like this. You read everything, every piece of research you can get your hands on. You talk about measurement all the time.
Yes.
And you work with kids all the time. And I think there is if you want to be a child researcher, there is no better model than that. But you need all of them. You need to think, you need to know theory, you need to know measurement, and you need to have your hands on children.
I agree, and I think there's not enough of that balance in most graduate programs. So I wholeheartedly agree.
It's hard to get that and go to graduate school at the same time.
Yeah, sometimes you have to make it yourself, I think, make that happen. I had a mentor, one of my mentors said, you got to go out and find that lab, those kids that you're going to just help and is, you're going to be able to try out your ideas. And it's a good thing.
The best ideas sometimes don't work,
Yeah.
Work. We're trying to learn executive functioning tasks for my Downs grant, and it's like somebody's really genius about those tasks, but we've been through about 8 things, and none of them really work for 2.5-year-olds with Down syndrome. They don't work. But the only way we would have figured that out is by building these ridiculous plexiglass boxes and all these things.
Sure.
And still struggling. And that led us to struggle with the idea, what is executive functioning? If the task, this is a good task to measure that in a typical toddler, why is it not a good task to measure? Are we measuring that same construct with a child with Down syndrome when the task is so daunting, or when they just want to take your well-made plexiglass box apart?
Sure.
Yeah, you learn a lot that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We're thinking, I'm learning a lot myself about these kind of mediators and kind of steps towards different outcomes and how one of the tasks of research is really trying to understand that path to an outcome.
Right.
So that makes sense to me. And I think for the students, it's important to hear kind of some of this background discussion about how how it all fits together with intervention and measurement and the theory and driving principles. So
it's the best puzzle ever, don't you think?
It's quite interesting, quite wonderful work, and it's good to be able to make a difference, but also try to like you said, replicate and solve some of these small questions and bigger questions to contribute. So it's quite nice. I agree. Well, thank you, Ann. Thanks for taking so much time. We meant for this to be shorter, but thanks for your generosity.
Your class sounds awesome. I'd like to be in your class.
Oh, thank you. That's a nice compliment. Yeah, and I think this conversation is a good segue for where we're at with this class, in that we're talking a lot about reading comprehension and what goes into reading comprehension. So I think we'll have quite an interesting discussion right now.
So our little crowd of 2-year-olds, we just assessed them for reading. They just came in for Time 5 assessments. I haven't looked at it yet. But I'm really interested to see how they're doing on reading.
Can I come see your little school?
Yeah.
My wife her family lives in Knoxville, so.
Oh, just let me know. Come anytime.
Okay.
We'd love to have you. That'd be great.
Thank you.
Good. Have a good class.
Have a nice day. Bye.